Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name's Dana Allen. I'm a senior fellow here and editor of Survival. And we welcome back a prodigal son of the Institute who was a research associate here in 79, 80, did you say?
The Jurassic area, yes.
The Jurassic area. Rob Litwak is Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University at the School of Foreign Service, a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He served on the National Security Council staff as a senior director for non-proliferation in the first Clinton administration, by which I mean the first term of Bill Clinton's administration. And in addition to his time here at the IISS, he's held fellowships at Harvard, at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and at Oxford University. And he's the author of a number of survival articles, which I was going to print out, and then I forgot to, but I would remember the titles, but they're on the subject of proliferation and rogue states.
The New Calculus of Preemption and Non-Proliferation, the Dilemmas of Regime Change, or something like that.
And the author of a number of books, including most recently this monograph from the Wilson Center, Iran's Nuclear Chess, After the Deal, which I think just came out in a new edition after the deal. And he's here to talk to us about the challenges of implementation, which I think will spark probably a very interesting discussion afterwards. So 30 minutes or so, Rob?
Fine. Thank you very much, Dana. It's a pleasure to be back at the IISS, where I got my professional start when it was located over on Tavistock Street. Many of the challenges we were likely to face in implementing the nuclear deal were augured during the protracted negotiations necessary to reach it. On the surface, the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is a straightforward trade-off between technology and transparency. That Iran is permitted to retain a bounded nuclear program in return for assurances that it's not masquerading as a weapons program. A straightforward trade-off. It should have been not an afternoon's work for non-proliferation specialists, but it shouldn't have required 20 months of protracted negotiations after diplomatic fits and starts over the previous decade. The reason that it took so long to reach the deal, and that those protracted negotiations, as I will argue today, augur sort of issues that will arise during the implementation. The reason is that for both the United States and Iran, the nuclear issue is a proxy, a surrogate for a more fundamental debate. In Iran, the nuclear issue is a surrogate for their unresolved identity crisis, whether the country, the Islamic Republic, is a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. In America, the nuclear deal has been a stand-in, a proxy for the post-9/11 debate about what U.S. strategy should be toward those states that the United States has designated as rogue states. And when I worked on the National Security Council staff, the term rogue state entered the U.S. foreign policy lexicon. This was the President of the United States asserting that a disparate group of states, which included Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya, constituted a distinct category of states in the international system. When I went back to the Wilson Center after my leave to be on the NSC staff, I wrote a series of publications, 3 books, that started off critically examining the term rogue state. Where did it come from? How did it get translated into policy? What were the contradictions associated with it? And led to two successor volumes. But in the current period, with respect to the nuclear deal, the nuclear negotiations have been an extension of this post 9/11 debate about what the strategy should be towards the rogue states and whether the United States' objective in dealing with these states, toward these states, should be to change their conduct, their behavior, or it should be to change the regime itself, the regimes themselves. After 9/11, which did not change the structure of international relations, but did lead to a redefinition of threat, threat became linked to the character of regimes. Hence, behavior change was inadequate because the dangerous behavior of states like Iraq and Iran was viewed as being inextricably linked to the character of the regime. So if you wanted to, in effect, turn off the bad behavior, you had to go to the source, which was the character of the regime. This argumentation was central to the case for preventive war in Iraq, which was an example of coercive non-proliferation through a change of regime. 8 months later, the Libya deal was announced, and that offered an alternative model. Non-proliferation not through a change of regime, but a change within a regime. The deal that was struck with Gaddafi, where the British government played a central role in making it happen. The crux of the Libya deal, unstated, was a tacit but clear security assurance that if Gaddafi gave up his unconventional weapons, that the United States would fall off of the objective of changing the Gaddafi regime. Thereafter, the Bush administration was caught between precedents. It couldn't replicate the Iraq model of coercive non-proliferation through external intervention, and it was unwilling to offer Iran, as well as North Korea, the type of security assurance that had been central to sealing the Libya deal. By 2005, the situation in Iran had changed. A radical president, Ahmadinejad, had replaced Khatami as president, and centrifuges were spinning at Natanz. The Bush administration, though, was sending out a consistently mixed message, whether the U.S. objective was to change the regime, to change the behavior or the conduct of these target states. It wasn't clear, as critics put it, whether Bush was prepared to take yes for an answer if Iran did come into compliance with its NPT obligations. President Obama campaigned on a controversial platform of engaging adversarial states. He made it clear that under his administration, the United States would be prepared to take yes for an answer. There was a rebooting of U.S. policy toward the group referred to as rogue states. He changed the nomenclature, referring to this disparate group of states not as rogues, but rather as outlier states, and recasting the issue, the challenge they pose, not in terms of a unilateral American political concept, rogue, but rather in terms of commitments these states had undertaken through international treaties, and framed the issue with Iran not as an American issue vis-a-vis Iran, but rather that Iran was in non-compliance with its NPT obligations. And that rebooting of policy laid the predicate for strengthening the multilateral sanctions that were central to bringing Iran back to the table. The Obama administration offered Iran, as well as North Korea, what I would call a structured choice: to come into compliance with their NPT obligations and to integrate into the international system, or face continued isolation and punitive measures. The Obama administration pursued a two-track strategy of pressure and engagement. The pressure was amped up through targeted sanctions aimed at the regime's core constituencies, its core interest groups like the Revolutionary Guard. The Obama administration built on sanctions that had started under George W. Bush, the second administration, and they were augmented with the EU financial sanctions and broader, tougher sanctions on the oil and energy sectors. financial institutions faced a choice of either severing their links with Iran or being blocked from the U.S. banking system. And in 2012, there was the exclusion of Iran from the SWIFT system for clearing checks, which made normal commerce for Iranian commercial entities very difficult to do. In addition to or complementing the pressure, was the engagement component. And Obama clarified the mixed message, making clear that the U.S. sought to bring Iran into compliance with its NPT obligations. It fell off of, eschewed the regime change rhetoric of the George W. Bush administration, and offered, in essence, the full Libya deal to Iran, the security assurance that the United States would not pursue a strategy of regime change or threaten such to Iran. The inconvenient fact of NATO's 2011 intervention in Libya, however, priced the United States essentially out of the security assurance market. That what had been central to the Libyan deal, the security assurance, was taken off the table, in effect, by the Libyan intervention, because at the Wilson Center or IISS or a university, one could make an analytical distinction between 2011 and Libya was a humanitarian intervention, not a counterproliferation intervention, but that's a distinction without a difference if you're sitting in Tehran of why the United States and the NATO allies went into Libya, and indeed the Supreme Leader pointed to that intervention as an example of how, as evidence of Gaddafi's kind of foolhardiness in taking the deal in 2003 when it was offered. The question for Bush had been, would he take yes for an answer? But by 2011, 2012, Obama critics were saying, will he take no for an answer if Iran is not interested in doing nuclear diplomacy? And in addition to the Libyan intervention that complicated the diplomacy, there's a more fundamental issue from Iran's perspective with the structured choice, integration or isolation. And this goes to the heart of the identity crisis in Iran that will be a kind of a theme in my remarks, namely that for Iran, integration into the international system, more broader engagement by them into the system, is viewed by hardline elements in the regime as a threat to regime security, as a source of political contagion. The opportunity for revived diplomacy came with the election of a pragmatist president in Iran in June 2013. Rouhani, more of a pragmatist, my Iran watcher friends tell me, than a moderate. With his election, one factor of which, underlying which, was the pressure that Iran was feeling from economic sanctions. With that election, Iran's supreme leader Khamenei delegated authority to Rouhani and to the foreign minister Zarif to take over the nuclear portfolio and to seek a resolution of the diplomatic impasse that was creating this source of pain in Iran. Rouhani acknowledged that economic sanctions were taking their toll on the Iranian economy. Economic sanctions brought Iran to the table. They were thus a necessary condition for revived diplomacy, but it was not a sufficient condition to reach a deal. Getting to yes in Vienna also required a strategic and political calculation by the Tehran regime. I'll have more on the political calculation in a minute, but first turn to the strategic aspect of the deal and its implications. Iran's mastery of uranium enrichment gives it an inherent hedge option for a nuclear weapon. The former IAEA chief El-Baradei said that a state that had mastered the fuel cycle, uranium enrichment, was a virtual nuclear weapon state. The strategic ambiguity of a hedge serves Iranian national security interests. Iran does not face an existential threat for which it must urgently acquire nuclear weapons. The Iranian program is determined, it's incremental, but this is not a crash program to get a weapon as quickly as possible. It's not the Manhattan Project. Iranian leaders have acknowledged that the hedge is what one could call Iran's strategic sweet spot. Rafsanjani said when he was president, so the quote goes back some years, but all Iran has to do is demonstrate its ability to enrich uranium, and others will draw the appropriate conclusions from that. So the strategic sweet spot for Iran is the hedge. It does not face an urgent necessity to weaponize. Obama, during the negotiations, has pursued the essentially standard U.S. approach to nonproliferation in dealing with these hard cases, which is to buy time. In the midst of the negotiations, President Obama said that the Tehran regime could make a strategic calculation, in inverted commas, to defer a decision to weaponize. But critics of the P5+1 diplomacy argued that allowing Iran to retain even a latent capability, this hedge option for acquiring nuclear weapons, was unacceptable, going back to the redefinition of threat because of the character of the regime. This was the crux of the dispute between Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama, and their competing red lines. President Netanyahu, certainly in his speech to the American Israel Political Action Committee in 2012, was pushing for a full rollback, zero centrifuges spinning, a full rollback of the program. President Obama set the American red line further along the technological continuum at weaponization. And President Obama said at one point, our strategy toward Iran is not containment, it's prevention. And this, in my view, was an unfortunate, has taken on an unfortunate connotation and a departure from traditional U.S. strategy. The connotation of containment in the nuclear context by Obama was that the United States would not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, the Obama red line at weaponization, and that the United States would not acquiesce to Iranian acquisition, would not deter Iranian nuclear weapons with American nuclear weapons. That was the connotation that containment had taken on. And that, of course, is a departure from Kennan's original conception of containment, which was as essentially a geostrategic holding operation, balancing power until the internal contradictions of a society played out over time, and led to either a reform of the regime, its mellowing, as Kennan put it, or to its collapse. This is important, and it's not some fetishism about language in the same way the shift from rogue state to outlier state is not a fetishism about language and nomenclature. It's the policy approaches that undergird it. And from an American perspective, I think the take three.
I've tried it many times myself.
Delegitimation. I won't tell you where trying to say circumscribe has led me, but it's a different type of thing. I would generally avoid the delegitimation of the term containment is unfortunate because American grand strategy has been, as John Eikenberry at Princeton and others have argued, American grand strategy is integration. Roosevelt saw that as post-World War II. You integrate defeated powers, adversarial states into the system. The default alternative to our preferred, I shouldn't say our, instead of sitting in London, the U.S. preferred grand strategy is not hard regime change as was pursued in 2003 in Iraq. The default alternative to integration is containment, holding this balancing of power exercise until adversarial states mellow over time, or at least you contain the consequences of that. And if you had to do in a IR 101 course over at King's or LSE and just say to students, what is the U.S. strategy toward Iran right now. The short form version is the United States is pursuing containment of Iran. I mean, containment is not incompatible with limited engagement on specific functional issues of concern, but overall the approach is to balance power in the region, engage pragmatically on issues of mutual concern, but allow the internal processes to play out in the view that that's a more organic approach to changing of regimes. It's more legitimate and more durable if it occurs organically rather than as opposed externally. And if you look at the Tom Friedman interview that President Obama did, with Tom Friedman, it's a great interview, and it really reflects President Obama's approach to strategy and essentially a view of agency in history, and that external intervention is neither legitimate nor durable. And so this is it's ironic that the administration has eschewed the term containment, since that is America's default alternative grand strategy when states resist integration, as Iran has done because of this identity crisis, viewing integration as a source to regime survival and regime security. The day that President Obama walked into the White House, Iran had on the order of 5,000 centrifuges spinning. So the desire of some in the Bush administration and of Prime Minister Netanyahu for a full rollback of the program was not a feasible, attainable diplomatic objective. And indeed, the non-aligned movement met in Tehran in 2012, and they endorsed the Iranian position, namely that Article 4 of the NPT, the technology transfer provision of the NPT, allowed states to acquire the full fuel cycle. And I know there's a historian of the NPT in the audience, and the P5 nuclear weapon states, our lawyers should have been better briefed, and they should have asked for stronger language on Article 4. But alas, it is not there, and in fact, on the ground in Iran, had passed by the moment where a zero centrifuge option was going to be a realistic outcome in the negotiations. So hence, the focus of the negotiations was not on rolling back the program, but on bounding the program. And that's the core bargain of the joint comprehensive plan of action. Iran will retain a bounded nuclear uranium enrichment program under intrusive inspections in return for sanctions relief. To get to yes required the Supreme Leader to make a tough decision, whether the economic benefits of the agreement outweighed the political risks. And in the diplomatic endgame, there was creative diplomacy to bridge competing red lines. Recall, the Supreme Leader improbably tweeting his red lines had on the order of a dozen red lines about no dismantlement, etc. And the United States and the P5, partners, plus one partners had their own red lines, that there had to be a substantial scaling back of the size of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But running throughout the negotiations was a question whether the Iranian negotiators actually spoke for the Supreme Leader or not. And in the endgame, Secretary of State Kerry said baldly to Foreign Minister Zarif, "Can you do this deal if we dine it?" Because there was the situation of the deal in 2009 in Vienna, where a deal went back to Tehran only to fall apart there, and he was assured there was. David Sanger of the New York Times did outstanding reporting on the negotiations, and he talked about the ordinary revolutionary state, ordinary country guys, and he and I had some contact during that, and he said, he was in Lausanne, and he says, all the ordinary country guys are here. All right, they want Iran to do this deal, but they're on the phone talking to the deep state back in Tehran, the revolutionary state guys, and they're trying to work through this. They did get to yes, and Iran in decision making is opaque, but one can surmise the Supreme Leader made that political calculation about economic benefits exceeding political risks. In policy analysis, there's the classic dichotomy between transactional and transformational politics. And one of the arguments that I make in the Iran monograph is that the JCPOA is a deal, not a grand bargain. Both Obama and Iran's supreme leader have defended the deal in transactional terms. Obama has argued that the deal addresses an urgent national security imperative, constraining Iran's nuclear capabilities. The supreme leaders defended the deal also in transactional terms, that it's going to win Iran relief from punitive economic sanctions. But underlying this transactional defense of the deal, both leaders are making a tacit transformational bet. Obama is betting, sort of channeling Kennan here, that in 15 years, Iran's going to be in a different place. At minimum, it buys 10 to 15 years, which is good in its own terms, and Obama is a card-carrying pragmatist, a utilitarian. But there's also this transformational bet that in 15 years, Iran may just be in a different place. The revolution will have moderated, and Iran will just have a different attitude towards the rest of the international system. The supreme leader is making the exact opposite bet, namely that Iran can pocket the economic sanctions relief and prevent political contagion, and that the deep state, in essence, will prevail. Obama, the American political debate kind of unfolded in September when the action moved to the Senate, and President Obama argued that the great strength of the deal is that it buys 15 years, 10 to 15 years. And the critics jumped on that and said, that's the problem. It only buys 10 to 15 years. And at the end of that process, this regime will still be in power. Recall that for many of the critics of the deal, they view threat as linked to the character of the regime, not necessarily just to the capabilities. There was much talk about what Secretary of State Kerry called the unicorn, what his critics called the better deal. It was never really fleshed out what this better deal would be, because for many of the critics, it wasn't a question of 5,000 centrifuges allowed versus 4,000 centrifuges. It was the idea of doing a deal, any deal, with Iran. And a key moment, and kind of kudos to the British FCO, the UK ambassador to Washington, the United States, Peter Westmacott, as part of the P5+1, had an important meeting with Democratic senators who were on the fence, and made the case that there was no better deal to be had, that this was the deal. The technical report just provided by the IAEA, which the Board of Governors is considering today, is in essence the first test of the JCPOA. Under the JCPOA, Iran committed to a process to resolve its possible military dimensions. It didn't require a positive resolution of the possible military dimensions from the U.S. and Western point of view. It committed Iran to a process, and that process has played out. Iran has met the bare minimum requirements, and it's likely that the IAEA leadership, the 35 member state directorate of the IAEA, will find Iran to have complied with that aspect of it. The technical report bears out the 2007, builds on the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate of the United States that Iran had indeed a weaponization program going until 2003, and indeed in this report argues that it continued until 2009. But both supporters and critics are jumping on the report to bolster their position. Critics of the report argue that Iran's unwillingness to come clean, really, on its past military activities calls into question their good faith to implement the agreement down the line. And Iran has stuck to their narrative, this hard line that this has always been, that their program has always been a peaceful program, and they've stuck to it implausibly, even as this report and previous IAEA reports point to demonstrable kind of activities that they engaged in that reflect an intent to explore the nuclear weapon option. And indeed, I think Iran might have been better served if they'd gone with former Iranian President Rafsanjani, who acknowledged that Iran did explore the nuclear option when Iran was diplomatically isolated. The world had acquiesced while Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran. That they did explore a nuclear weapons option during the Iran-Iraq War. That would have been a more plausible narrative than them sticking to the narrative that they'd never had any intention of going that route. In conclusion, let me lay out sort of 5 issues that I see as sort of as implementation challenges. First, getting to yes required creative diplomacy to bridge competing red lines. The Supreme Leader said, for example, no dismantlement. The United States insisted that there be and the P5+1 insisted on a scaling back of Iran's capabilities. This creative diplomacy to bridge competing red lines created a zone of ambiguity. And I think that Iran may well push the envelope, to use a Tom Wolfism, push the envelope in the zone of ambiguity. And that's one potential source of contention. If they push that envelope, this leads to my second point. There's the question of what to do. And it's not if Iran is accused of, inverted commas, cheating on the accord, but when it's accused of cheating on the accord. And in this context, I would cite the North Korean example from 2002 as a negative example of what not to do. The Bush administration confronted North Korea in 2002 of a covert, highly enriched uranium program. At the time, North Korea was under the agreed framework of 1994 that had frozen its activity at the Yongbyon reactor, which was a plutonium-based program. In the late 90s, the public enemy number 1 of nonproliferation, AQ Khan, transferred centrifuges to North Korea that started their HEU program. And by 2002, it had reached the point where the Bush administration confronted North Korea on it. In order to confront North Korea on a HEU program of unknown scope and unknown urgency, the Bush administration abrogated the agreed framework, which had a plutonium program of known scope and known urgency bottled up, frozen. When the agreed framework collapsed, the United States essentially acquiesced to North Korea acquiring this small arsenal that we have that it now has of 10 weapons, and it's poised to, through the HEU road, to build a much more substantial arsenal. So the takeaway from that is that don't repeat when there is an issue of contention and a charge of cheating, don't abrogate the JCPOA. Rather, use the JCPOA, the Joint Commission framework that's part of it, to as the forum for resolving it. And there's a process sort of laid out there. But politically, there may be an impulse at the first charge of cheating, get out of the agreement. Certainly from opponents in the United States. The third point on affecting implementation goes back to the more one of the themes of my monograph, namely that the nuclear deal, the nuclear pact is a deal, not a grand bargain. The Obama administration made a pragmatic decision not to broaden the negotiations to try to include Iran's regional role, and Iran certainly didn't want to broaden the negotiations either. I think it was a pragmatic move that if the broadening had occurred, we probably would not have gotten to yes on the nuclear arrangement. But even though Iran's regional policies are outside the four corners of the agreement, Iran's conduct in the region and beyond will affect the politics of the implementation. And here I would point to the example in 2002 when the Bush administration was pragmatically engaging Iran on an area of mutual interest, Afghanistan, after 9/11. There was the Karine A episode where the ship was resupplying the Palestinians that became the occasion for the Bush administration to end that dialogue with Iran, and then Iran got included in the infamous axis of evil in the 2002 Bush inaugural. And I think in this context, it's important. It's just the cognizance of that is important. That Iranian conduct in areas outside of the four corners of the agreement could affect the politics of implementing the deal. The regional scene now could hardly be more complicated, where the United States is sort of tacitly aligned with Iran in Iraq and opposed to it in Syria. The political kind of valence signs are different in these different contexts. But our forces are very close to each other. So when you talk about the possibility of an inadvertent naval engagement at the head of the Persian Gulf, I think one has to be aware and cognizant that of the implications of some clash between Iran and the United States that's outside of the agreement, affecting the agreement. My fourth point. Iran is left with its nuclear hedge from the JCPOA, and the question in the region is, will other states emulate Iran and try to create their own hedge? And what reassurance is required by external powers like the United States and the NATO powers to reassure regional allies of support such that they will not flirt with or reassess their non-nuclear intentions? The one country that's most usually kind of cited in this context is Saudi Arabia, which has said publicly that they will match Iran's capabilities. How would they do that? Would they try to develop their own fuel cycle infrastructure? That's expensive. You need expertise to do it. Or would they, as one of my, as one colleagues, colorfully put it, or would the Saudis just do what they normally do, which is to add a zero to the check to Pakistan and acquire a nuclear capability that way? Fifth and final point. This is a 10-year deal. A hedge, a new study from King's College, that, defines nuclear hedges is a combination of a capability, latency, plus the intent to acquire nuclear weapons. Iran's flirted with it, and they've got this capability, so they have the hedge. 10 years from now, but it should be noted as well that in the JCPOA, Iran reiterated all of its NPT obligations to remain a non-nuclear state, etc., signed on to the additional protocol, other measures that would attest to Iran remaining a non-nuclear weapon state. So the question is, how, in 10 years from now, can we reinforce that? Because in 10 years, Iran will be in a position to make a dash for the bomb. And part of our strategy has to ensure that Iran's hedge does not become a weapon. And that feeds into the broader issue of U.S. and allied relations with Iran. But I think it should be, the United States at minimum should not be a reason why another state should feel that it needs to acquire nuclear weapons. And that kind of brings us back to questions of security assurances for regimes that are non-nuclear and long-term durable non-proliferation strategies to ensure that the number of nuclear weapon states certainly does not go up and hopefully can go down. So let me close there.
Thank you, Rolf. Thank you very, very much. That was excellent and a lot of food for thought. I want to make a quick semantic comment and then ask you a question. But the comment can be interpreted as a question too, so maybe it's two questions. The comment is simply, I took your point about the problematic nature of saying I don't do containment on the part of the president because you're absolutely right. The default strategy is containment. But this was a very specific moment about a very specific thing because it was precisely the ambiguity of the word containment. Containment was taken to mean containing a nuclear-armed Iran, as we had supposedly contained a nuclear-armed Soviet Union. And Obama found himself in a position where he either had to or really wanted to be very, very clear that we were not going to do that kind of containment. So I just wonder, the suggestion that this has untoward implications wasn't entirely clear to me, because obviously in the broader political strategic terms, we are still doing containment. The question is, maybe, and I apologize for this question because it's so obvious and conventional, but it strikes me as very important nonetheless. I mean, possibly the most opaque and important question is what's going to happen in Iran. But you look for look for issues where like the drunk against the light post, and it's also very interesting what's going to happen in the United States. Every Republican candidate, as I understand it, is committed to, I don't know if they've explicitly said tearing up this deal, but are opposed to the deal and say they're not going to accept it.
Yeah.
What would happen if a Republican president?
Yeah, on your first point, I think the context that you described is completely accurate. That containment in this context was viewed, the nuclear context was viewed as essentially acquiescing to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons and then deterring theirs with ours. I think, having worked on the National Security Council staff, writing and talking about my policy is not containment, it's probably a better talking point than saying my policy is not acquiescing and deterring. And so it conveyed the meaning there. But I just wanted, I think it would be a pity if the term containment was delegitimized in the U.S. debate, because, and eschewed from our foreign policy lexicon, because that is our default alternative strategy, and it's our game plan in dealing with hard case countries. And certainly when states resist integration, it's preferred to 2003 type hard regime change. I don't know what to say about the U.S. debate. I characterized it in terms of this post 9/11 debate over whether the emphasis should be on changing the conduct of regimes or changing the regimes themselves, and that's persisted. The United States has its own political culture. Because it's the magnitude power that it does. What it does affects a lot of other states. But part of that political culture is, for example, withholding diplomatic recognition towards states that the United States finds objectionable. Not consistently, but we don't have, the U.S. does not have diplomatic relations with Iran for obvious reasons, or North Korea. It withholds it. Establishing the diplomatic relations with Cuba has been a politically thorny issue. I think that speaks to how these hard cases are kind of viewed in the United States, and the kind of resistance to engagement strategies, and viewing what pragmatic engagement is often castigated as close to being appeasement. And appeasement is when you give a concession and get nothing in return for it. And on the nuclear diplomacy with Iran is an example for the political scientists in the crowd of what the great American political scientist Alexander George called conditional reciprocity. It's not appeasement. It's not concessions granted. That each step of the agreement requires both parties to undertake certain actions, and the agreement will be suspended if one party fails to live up to its obligations. Whether you could retract some concessions, for example, if sanctions were lifted, could you have that? There's this political question of how realistic is the threat of snapback sanctions. Could you kind of get this multilateral pressure again on Iran? I think that's a legitimate concern looking out over the length of time of this agreement.
Edwina.
Could I come back to does yes mean yes from an Iranian regime point of view, point that you brought up a number of times. You mentioned that the role of the IAEA at this stage has been finessed by wording about process, but there's going to come a point where the IAEA is going to have to say whether they think the program of work that Iran has is entirely peaceful.
In 8 years, for sure.
In 8 years,
Yeah.
in other words, before
Yeah.
the 10 to 15
Yeah.
year thing. We know that countries like South Africa that have changed their strategy on nuclear weapons have worked closely with the agency to try and demonstrate their peaceful intentions. It's taken a lot longer than that to get to the bottom of it. We have Iran, which is, as you point out yourself, trying to maintain a degree of ambiguity about this and not being clear about what it's been up to in the past. So what happens when we get to that point? And the follow-on question from that is, to the extent that the IAEA's judgment is not taken as strictly what it is, are we going to find ourselves without an NPT? In other words, what is the fate of the NPT when we get to that point?
Excuse me. Let me take the broader question first. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been this broader tipping point debate about nuclear weapons and whether, that you had the five, then you had the three states that are outside of the NPT, Israel, Pakistan, India, and in the 1990s you had some non-proliferation gains, states like South Africa, the former Soviet Union. You ended up with just one nuclear successor state, not 3, 4, or 5. So that was the 90s was viewed as after the Gulf War, you had a determination about the Iraqi program, which was more advanced than was thought before the Gulf War, which, sidebar, was part of what the context of the 2002-3 debate on Iraqi WMD was about. You had the agreed framework with North Korea. Then, in the following decade, the North Korea drops out of the NPT, detonates, and the reaction in Northeast Asia, you did not see a cascade of proliferation. Japan and South Korea, there were rumblings of reassessing their nuclear intentions, but extended deterrence and reassurance appeared to have worked, at least for the time being, of preventing other nuclear follow-on proliferation in Northeast Asia. And we don't live in Kennedy's nightmare scenario world from his 1962 General Assembly speech of a world of 30, 35 nuclear weapon states. I think that speaks to the fact that most countries don't believe they need nuclear weapons as an answer to their national security threats. So I don't see this sort of general drive towards proliferation. And even if, and this is contentious, even if Iran were to be viewed as in violation of its NPT, sort of cheating from within and eroding the regime from within, would that be the action-forcing event that would get a host of countries to reassess their nuclear intentions? I think that's a national decision. Opting out of the NPT, it's a much bigger context. What happens 8 years from now will be conditioned not only by whether Iran can shift from the hallmark of its program, which is opacity and ambiguity, to greater transparency. And we'll see. I think it's not trying to get out of answering the question. By the way, when I was a researcher associate at the ISS, they did some media training, and they said, like for doing BBC World Service, they said, if asked a question you don't know, just say, the next 24 hours will tell. And so I don't think the next 24 hours will tell, but just in part, the answer will be how this unfolds over the next 8 years on the dismantling of the centrifuges and what Iran does. That in year 7, if they've done everything, and the potential areas of contention that I alluded to don't arise, that'll create a political context for the determination. But it's a critical, juncture. Mark Fitzpatrick just blogged about it on the ISS website. I think it was a good posting.
Yes.
Tim Wills at King's College. Thank you. Very, very interesting talk indeed. Just 2 quick points. You sort of suggest that Iran's wider regional conduct is going to be a challenge, but also I sense, slightly suggested, that it's slightly divorced from the agreement itself. But of course, Iran is going to get this windfall of anything between $20 billion and $100 billion. No one seems to know quite how much, which they're of which a certain amount is bound, it seems to me, to go to regional allies, whether it's Hezbollah or whatever. So, I mean, there is a direct connection there. And the other point, I'll sort of postulate a 6th implementation challenge.
Great.
Which is that Khamenei clearly has made his decision on the basis that he'll be able to renew Iran's aging hydrocarbon infrastructure and various other projects, and access
further fry the biosphere.
Yeah,
great.
Access to Western technology and so forth. And yet the agreement as agreed makes it almost impossible for Western banks, certainly, to support such deals. I mean, you've got snapback clauses, you mentioned in the snapback clause. You've got US not necessarily withdrawing all its secondary sanctions, and there seems to be a great debate about whether these can be withdrawn at presidential diktat or whether they need congressional approval.
We call it a waiver, not a diktat. It's okay.
Okay, waiver. And not being able to use US dollars in transactions. I mean, it seems to me that presents a potential problem.
The 50-minute version of this talk includes those points. more of the point. I think you're right. There was a lot of discussion by the Obama administration of what the windfall would mean, because the critics of the deal, pointed to the $100 billion figure, and our Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, kind of ratcheted that down to kind of a more realistic level. But a lot of the operations that Iran has done, with proxies doesn't require great deal of funds, and President Obama, argued that Iran has so much in the way of deferred infrastructure, investments to make, that a chunk of that is likely to go into domestic needs, particularly since the regime, in making the political calculation to do the deal and getting sanctions relief, will need to have something to kind of show for that. Your point about secondary sanctions, and I'm sure there's some private sector folks here. The cautionaries that are out on investing in Iran, because of the economic uncertainty of whether the foreign financial institutions will really jump in with capital. I think that'll be there. Sort of this, it's not a moral hazard; it's sort of an economic hazard there. There may be a revival of an effort to impose secondary sanctions in the United States. I think those, as in the mid-'90s over the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, can be deflected by the executive, because secondary sanctions, as I recall from when I was on the NSC, the debate over ILSA, which the Libya part dropped out eventually, but not just the Iran Sanctions Act, but said that secondary sanctions makes the United States the issue in international relations, not Iran. So instead of it being the United States and the world versus Iran to get it to come into compliance with sanctions, the secondary sanctions makes this controversial, potentially illegal application of extraterritorial sanction on foreign commercial entities makes the United States the issue. So I think that would be, I think the waiver provisions could probably avoid the worst consequences of that.
Yes.
My name is Kazan. I have worked with Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. I have a question about NPT, because when NPT was proposed in the 1960s, there were two commitments from countries who didn't have nuclear weapon, not to go this way. But there was another commitment also from 5 countries who had nuclear weapons to reduce their capability. But this doesn't happen. My question is a legal problem. If a treaty is valid, if some parts which have to engage themselves to reduce their weapons, they didn't agree, between Soviet Union and the United States. There were decades of discussions, but it didn't succeed.
The core bargain that you referred to is sort of Article 6, the commitment of the powers to act in good faith to achieve disarmament, and Article 4 that provides states in compliance with their non-nuclear obligations under the NPT to get access to new technology transfers. There's been a lot of discussion at the NPT review conferences about the Article 6 commitment and whether it's been lived up to or not. I don't think the United States and Russia have a bad story to tell. During the Cold War, we had between 12 and 15,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other. The current size of the arsenals, as the Milbau reports, is they're down to about 2,000 weapons, and could go even further if other nuclear weapon states could be brought on board as part of multilateral nuclear arms control. So I don't think that's a bad story to tell, and to go from 12,000, 15,000, down to 2,000. So there's been some headway on Article 6. I'm cognizant there's an Article 6 expert in the room here who's written on that, but dissertation at King's. I don't know if Matthew's here. Yeah, he's
right there, but he doesn't seem to be.
You can add or correct anything.
So
anyway, so anything.
Good. I see Norman Dombey and.
I apologise for being so late. My train was an hour and a half.
Oh dear.
From Brighton, which is a record. One point you make about whether the United States is the villain or whether it's Iran which is the villain in any dispute. And also what happens if the United States imposes sanctions or pulls out of the agreement. I think the short bit of your talk, which I actually heard, it seemed to me that you were talking as if it was a bilateral agreement between the US and Iran. It seems to me that if the US imposed sanctions or even pulled out of the agreement would carry on. Iran would just decide to carry on in the absence of the US.
I apologize for the American-centric presentation.
Yes.
It's because I'm coming from Washington. I've worked on the U.S. policy side, but also I think it's fair to say that the two key interlocutors in the P5 was the United States and Iran, and a lot of the work was done bilaterally, and then the circle was broadened in to bring in others. And there are strong political headwinds against nuclear diplomacy in the United States. It's hard to know in terms of the U.S. campaign, how much is sort of campaigning, and what a new president would the situation that he or she would face in office, and it would be a hard political calculation for an American president to withdraw from this multilateral diplomacy if it's working well. A political risk that I pointed to was if there is an occasion for quote unquote cheating, how that should be addressed, and made the argument that the United States should not pull out of the agreement which could have adverse consequences, as President Obama would say, on a host of issues, but would make the United States the issue if it's viewed as having done so on grounds that don't bear up to international scrutiny. So I think that would be a constraint on a new president. That might be what social scientists call an OH, an optimistic hypothesis. But
But just to extend, or I think to, the part of the question that is interesting. I mean, it's all interesting, but is if you had a situation where the United States, a new U.S. administration, for example, in the view of its other P5 plus one partners, including, let's say, just for the sake of argument, the UK, France, and Germany, was unreasonably trying to scupper the agreement.
Right.
Would those partners at least be in a position to sort of credibly say, you know what, we're going to maintain the agreement and keep it in place? How would that work? Actually,
we'd be in uncharted waters, but one could plausibly see that happening, and then the United States would. We're talking kind of variants and hypotheticals here, which are always problematic. But what you're really talking about is a return to sort of hard unilateralism by the United States, and in that event, you could see the possibility of the JCPOA continuing. Certainly, the Europeans, the EU would not reimpose their sanctions, which were the ones which, on top of the American ones, had real bite in Iran, and it would become a transatlantic crisis as well as a U.S.-Iran non-proliferation crisis.
The next 24 months will tell.
The late Stanley Hoffman said, problems have solutions, dilemmas have horns. So,
well, let me just. We're out of time, and I'm sure we're not actually out of questions, but I don't see any more. So it's a good conjuncture. So it just leaves me to ask everybody to join me in thanking you for an excellent session. Thank you.